this is almost planned, isn't it? So using a ferry glide as an example, because I'm guessing we're all whitewater paddlers, etc. So that's a good place to start. So once we've got our person on the water and they've warmed up and we're starting to set those tasks, if they're ferry gliding, the first kind of things I'd be looking at from a observation analysis point of view at this stage are those three key principles of ferry gliding. So Reece has already mentioned one, which was angle. Then I'd be looking at what the boat's doing from an edge point of view, and then speed. And speed comes into different areas. So we've got speed into the flow, speed out of the flow, and then speed across the flow. And if we've chosen the ideal venue, I guess, is a venue that's got a consistent flow across it. But there's not too many of those about, is there? So we need to be changing our speed as we go across. So from a coaching point of view, that will be the first area or first three areas I'd be looking at. So can they achieve the task? Can they actually ferry glide across the bit of water? And then once they can do that, how can we improve it? And then starting to set them little tasks around those three key principles. So what about if we speed it up out of the eddy, for example? What about if we speed it up as we got to the eddy line on the far side? How many strokes does it take to cross that bit of flow? And then how can we reduce those strokes? So what we tend to find with our beginners, if you want, or learners at this stage, is they get into the flow and they paddle, don't they, really, really fast. So they're using up lots of energy, and it's pretty inefficient and quite spishy splashy. So how can we slow that down? How can we improve their forward paddling at this stage and make it much more efficient? Angle-wise, we can let them experiment with angles. So again, as we said, it all will depend on how far you're ferry gliding across, how fast the flow is. Also what affects that is the type of boat they're in. So a shorter boat is going to react differently to a longer boat. A boat with sharp rails on it is going to react differently to a boat with more rounded edges on it. So a good analogy people use is a clock face. So 12 o'clock is directly upriver, and then we can set our angle. So we can be at 2 o'clock or 10 o'clock or 2:30 and 2:45 and stuff like that. So people can experiment and they can play around and explore what happens. So there might be times where they're exploring and they fail. And as long as they, if you want, fail safely, then that's okay, because they're learning from that. So you know, the optimum angle might be, for that bit of water, might be the boat set at 1 o'clock, for example, and they go in at 3 o'clock and get spun round. Yeah, and they realise that that's too much of a bigger angle, so then they bring it in again, and then they can play with things. And then ideally later on, we're changing the venue, so we've got a different flow, so we can see if they can take on what they've learned from that point with angles, and move it onto a different environment where they might need a different angle. How do we get edges across to people? How do we edge a boat? Because there's different ways to edge a boat, from raising their knee to moving their body to raising bum cheeks or putting more pressure on the opposite bum cheek. And how much edge do we need on that bit of flow? And how do people judge edges? So there's various ways of doing it. People can do it visually by looking at their craft and seeing how much water's coming up onto the side of the boat. Are they getting water onto their cockpit? Do we have a number system? So a boat flat is at 0, then we have a 1 or 2 and maybe a 3 edge. 4 usually means going over. And again, so they can start to put those 3 components together and explore and experiment to see what works for that environment in each direction. So speed, angle, edge, there's no set pattern. It can be edge, angle, speed. It's just those 3 components pretty much put together is how we ferry, the fundamentals of how we ferry glide. So previously we talked about the 5 Bs as well. So body, boat, blade, brain and background, I think, Reece, with the other 2 you used. Yeah, cool. So linked into that speed, angle, edge, we've also got those components we can look at. So it starts to get even more complex, a much bigger, more complicated picture. And And again, those are the things that are going to affect your speed, angle, edge. So if their body's not in the right position in the boat, and we've not got a good posture, and we're not connected correctly to the boat, that's probably going to affect our angle, and it's probably going to affect how we edge the boat as well. So there might be times where you might be going, right, this isn't working for some reason. I need to dig around and find out why this isn't really, isn't working. We're talking about edge. Can you edge the boat? Can you lift your knee up? Oh, yeah, well, actually, no, I can't, because it's not connected to the boat right. So let's pull you aside. Let's sort that out, and then let's get you back into the game. So some other things to play with there, body, boat, blade. And then once they're happy and having fun, then we're kind of coming into those games with aim. So what challenges can we set? So counting the amount of strokes that we use to get across the flow from when they hit the flow to when they get to the other side. And then can we reduce that amount of strokes? And how can we do that? And again, we can play around with analogies. So we can have an analogy where the river is boiling hot and our paddle's made of chocolate. So the more we put our paddle in the water, the more it's going to melt. We can play around with paddling on the downstream side only to see what effect that has on our ferry glide. We can have paddling on the upstream side only to see what effect that may have on our ferry glide. And then do we need a combination of some downstream and some upstream? When do upstream strokes work best? So usually as you're actually coming out of the flow to stop you bouncing off the eddy line. Downstream strokes work good to get into the flow. And as we spoke about, or somebody said earlier, a lot of it's about timing. So at what point do we hit the power as we hit the eddy line? Is it after we hit the eddy line? Is it the front of the boat that hits the flow? So lots of stuff going on in there. Another useful stroke then leading on from there. So we're just ferry gliding quite happily across, and we're using minimum strokes on the downstream side. So then can we develop that into a squeeze type stroke? So a nice slow downstream sweep stroke that's really slow towards the back. So we're starting to mix stuff up, and it's a kind of sweep stroke that kind of goes into a slow stern rudder and could almost be a slow hanging draw at times as well. So we're starting to combine and mix and just mix the whole thing up. Other things we can do to play around with our senses, and this needs to be really well controlled, is once our students into the flow, what about if they close their eyes so they can feel what's happening, and then they can feel the change of flow as they cross the eddy line on the far side. So the thing to be aware of there is we need to know everybody's name, because the control measure I always put in there is we do this one at a time. And if I call your name out, you need to open your eyes very quickly, because that's when you're going to hit something, or something's going to go horribly wrong. From a safety point of view, it's choosing the right venue, isn't it, for these type of tasks and challenges, making sure there's nothing intimidating just below there, so people are working in a comfortable environment. And they always say it's almost better to make harder moves on easier water than it is to challenge yourself by paddling on a harder environment. So hopefully that's given you some ideas just for playing around with ferry gliding particularly, but any of the moving water skills, speed, angle and edge have a major factor, and that's usually a good starting point, because once you've got our people onto moving water, they can usually paddle forwards and they've got a reasonable amount of control. And that's then the areas that we're developing, is changing speed, changing angles, changing edges. In a canoe, trim would probably come into play as well, in a kayak to a point. And remembering that our participants are all individuals, and that their boats are all going to handle slightly differently.